Hello there and welcome back to the Photography Made Simple podcast with me, your host, Audrey-Ann. Now, this week we are going to be talking about making the switch from full auto mode on your camera to manual mode. And most specifically, how we can do that in really gentle steps. Because as you probably already know by now, in order to get the photos that your camera is capable of, it really needs some guidance from you, which is why we never want to stay in auto mode for long. But I also know that it can seem extremely daunting to make that switch to full manual mode. You are used to the camera making all of the decisions for you in auto, and it can be really difficult to then take over absolutely everything all by yourself all at once. So I never actually recommend that you do that. You do want to start to gradually take control away from the camera and giving it to yourself. So you're making that transition in a really gentle way. And that is exactly what we're going to cover today. Hey there, I'm Audrey-Ann, founder of Live Snap Love, and I'm on a mission to help photographers just like you grow their photography skills quickly and in a way that feels simple and easy so you can shorten the learning curve and get photos you love faster. I created this Photography Made Simple podcast to share simple, actionable techniques, helpful insights, and practical advice on all things photography. So if you're itching to take your photos to the next level, whatever that level may be, you're in the perfect place. So let's get started. Now, before we actually get into the meat of how to make that transition away from auto to manual mode, it's actually really best to start by understanding what your camera is doing in auto mode. So when you shoot in auto mode, all your camera can do is have a look at the light available and try to come up with the correct exposure by setting the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO for you. Now, the problem here is the camera doesn't know what you're trying to photograph, so it aims for a middle ground. So that means it gives you a middle of the road aperture, it will give you a middle of the road shutter speed, and it'll probably give you a middle of the road ISO in order to try to cover all eventualities. And this is why you will often end up with photos that have that snapshot quality to them, because middle of the road settings is going to give you middle of the road photos. Now, for sure, you might luck out from time to time because the camera chooses the exact settings for that shot more by random luck than by intent, and you will luck out and get that good shot. But most of the time, you're going to end up with images that really just have that snapshot quality to them. There is another reason why we want to avoid auto mode, and that is because the camera will also frequently give you a shutter speed that is far too low, resulting in either just a little bit of motion blur in your shots, which can lead to them looking just not quite sharp, or a lot of motion blur where you can really see all the movement. And this is really common, especially when shooting indoors and even more so in low light. So that is why we want to move away from auto. We also have another host of reasons why we want to do that, but just simply to start moving away from what our camera gives us, which is middle of the road photos, usually with too much blur and too high an ISO and all the things that we don't want, to start to actually take control of it yourself so that you can get the photos that you do want. So here's a way to gently transition from auto to full manual mode that won't have you breaking out in a sweat or, having to learn everything before you can actually start to make the switch. So the first thing you can do is actually start by using scene modes. Now, scene modes are basically a way of telling the camera what you are photographing so that it can determine what is the most important setting, and it will work out an exposure based on that. So for example, if you were photographing a running child where you want to freeze the action, then you would choose something called sports or action. Different cameras call it different things, but you'll get the idea when you see the options that your camera has. And this way, by choosing the sports or the action mode, your camera knows that shutter speed is important. So it will choose a higher one to try and stop any motion blur. Or another example would be that you want to take a photo of someone and have that blurry background for that portrait style shot. Then in the scene mode, you would choose portrait, and it will assume that the most important setting is aperture, and it will select a larger aperture to help give you that blurred background. So basically, by choosing a scene mode is giving your camera a small clue as to what is going on so it can make some changes to the settings for you. By no means is it ideal or perfect, but it will get you closer than just using that full auto mode. Now, I'm not a fan of staying on these for very long at all, but they can be of help when you're very, very, very first starting out, as you can actually begin to see the changes that the camera makes in the same lighting situation between these different modes. Ultimately, though, you are still more intelligent than your camera is even in scene mode, which is why very swiftly you will then try to move on to any of the semi-automatic modes. Just like the name suggests, semi-automatic, these are this halfway house between full auto mode and manual mode. And it is the next step in your journey to full manual mode. Now, these modes allow you to choose what your most important setting is, and the camera works out the correct exposure by setting the remaining two for you. Now, the two main modes are aperture priority mode and shutter priority mode. Now, I pretty much always use aperture priority mode if I am going to use a semi-automatic mode, which is not very often, as I believe this gives you the most creative control for shooting children generally. But if you're in a situation where constant high shutter speed is vital, say a football match, then absolutely feel free to use shutter priority. Now, in addition to helping you get better settings and therefore better photos, using these semi-automatic modes will also start to allow other settings in your camera to come into play. For example, you can turn off your flash or shoot in RAW or choose your own focus point. Now, you will need to start choosing your own settings here because the camera's not going to be doing this for you. But don't worry, I do have something that will help you with this. You can download my free manual settings cheat sheet. It details all of this for you. You will find a link to it where you're listening to this podcast or in the show notes for this episode at livesnaplove.com/22. If you just want to go direct to the download, livesnaplove.com/manual-mode. And that is going to get you that free manual settings cheat sheet, which details the aperture speeds you should be using for different photos, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So go and download it. It's a one-page, full of goodness PDF. Okay, so we have moved from using the scene modes on our camera, which is giving our camera a clue to what we're photographing, but ultimately the camera is still making all of the decisions for us, to moving to semi-automatic mode, where you are choosing at least one of the settings yourself and then leaving the camera to balance the exposure with the remaining one or two settings from your aperture, your shutter speed, or your ISO. But the next stage, and you have the feeling I've been building up to this, it is manual mode. And that is because there's absolutely no substitute for being able to take full control of your camera. I think it's simply the best way to get the images that you dream of. Now, even if you think I will never use manual mode all the time, I strongly encourage you to use, or at least learn how to use manual mode. By learning how to use manual mode, you get an in-depth understanding of all of your settings, and you also understand how your camera is going to react in different situations, and crucially, how to meter for those different situations, because it's not going to be the same all the time. And that's why we can't just simply, I've heard of some people saying, I turn on the camera and to aperture priority mode, I see what the camera is going to give me, and then I turn the dial to M and I put in the same settings. That's not shooting in manual mode. That's just manually doing what your camera would do. We want to move away from that entirely. So I do recommend that you get onto shooting in full manual mode. And that way you can take control of the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO yourself. And ultimately, you want to take control over all the other settings in your camera too. You are the best person to be able to tell the camera what to do, because you're the only one of the two things that has eyes. Your camera cannot see and react to a scene in the way that you can, and it cannot know what you want it to do. You have to tell it. And the easiest way to do that is in manual mode. So my opinion is the sooner that you get started in manual mode, the better, because the sooner you're going to get good at it. So get going as soon as you can. So is there a learning curve? Yes. Will you stuff up a few times? Yes. Will you fumble around trying to get your settings right? Absolutely yes. But only for a little while. Soon, shooting in manual mode will become second nature to you so that you don't even think about it. So although I occasionally switch to a semi-automatic mode in very rare situation, it actually just feels weird to me now. So I actually end up going back to manual mode because I actually find it quicker. So it's something that I don't do very often. So we have thousands of students in our courses, and we have many who have come into our Auto to Awesome program, where we do actually teach you how to take control over every single setting on your camera so that you have full control and can get photos to look exactly the way you want them to. So we have loads of people who've come into that program on one of the semi-automatic modes, not really convinced that they need to make the switch to manual mode, but then are amazed in the differences that they can make to their photos just by taking that control. One student put it to me that they felt empowered by shooting in manual mode, and they understood why that makes such a difference to your photos. So if you are kind of going against this for a little while, I do want to encourage you to make that switch. Even if you only learn how to do it properly, you can always go back a step if you feel that you need to. Now, don't forget, I do have that free manual settings cheat sheet for you. You can go and download that, and I'll link to further resources that I think you'll find helpful over at the show notes for this episode, or you'll find it around where you're listening to this podcast. So that was it for this week. I'll be back again next week where I'll be sharing more photography goodness with you. Can't wait. See you then. So that wraps up this week's episode of Photography Made Simple. I'll be back at the same time, same place next week. But if you want more, head on over to livesnaplove.com/podcast, where you can find all the resources and the downloads mentioned, plus a whole lot more. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you won't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week.